It's now my great pleasure to introduce and to invite our Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide to the stage. Please come this way. So, dear Foreign Minister, thank you very much for joining us today. I get you're having a very busy time. Unfortunately, the world is such that you're too busy these days.
But that's why we need the Norfund and similar institutions to help fix it.
Well, keep on. As you know, our mission is to seek to reduce poverty through job creation and strengthening the private sector. And we set up to take risk by, for instance, investing in countries in conflict, a topic we discussed earlier this morning. In your mind, which are the areas where the private sector and development finance institutions represented here today can make the biggest difference?
Oh, so many areas. I think, we just, a few weeks ago, we had the annual Nordic African Foreign Ministers meeting, and it was very high on the agenda, and particularly from our African friends, was this to move from aid to trade, to increase investments, to facilitate private sector development is not a new theme, of course, but I'm just seeing how it is rising on the agenda. But at the same time, we all recognize that there are issues with cost of capital, with higher, doing the same thing in developing countries much more costly, and sometimes you need these risk-willing investments to trigger developments that eventually will be very constructive. So this was important, and it's becoming more important on all the issues you mentioned in your intervention. One area, I would say, is, of course, contributing to not only the energy transition from fossil to renewable, but also the increasing the amount of energy, clean energy, available in, for instance, African countries, just to take one continent, and then make that available for manufacturing so that you can move up the value chain and not only continue to export raw materials.
Good. And speaking of energy, you've been very active in the COP negotiations, leading the Norwegian delegation. And last
I actually wrote that final sentences that made it.
Well done. Give him a hand.
Transition away from fossil fuels was much easier than phase out. And it means the same, but it's...
Words matter, right? Yeah. Like we saw in the video here, the Climate Investment Fund that Norfund manages last year made investments that avoided emissions equivalent to 6 of Norway's annual emissions through all the projects on a total basis. And to what extent do you see that capital is a limiting factor? Some people complain that there's a lack of projects, but also lack of capital. To what extent do you see capital as an important element here?
Lack of capital and the cost of capital, in particular, because of the currency risk, because of administrative risks, because if you develop projects that are probably rentable in the long run, but in an unsecure environment, that is priced in the cost of capital, and that makes a lot of projects not happening. So this is really a serious challenge, both the cost of capital and the availability of capital. But I have to say that I think we also need to look at the sort of administrative framework, because, for instance, investing in renewable energy will give you an energy source that once you've invested in the facilities and in the photovoltaic plants or the windmills, is actually a cheaper unit price energy. But it requires, in order to have a balanced energy availability, not just the volume, but also have it at the right moment, the right place, and distribute it, you need grids and balancing, and that requires a high degree of organization. So it's less expensive, but more administrative burden in a broad sense. Not like just bureaucrats, but to have a culture of making things work. And, things happen at 8 o'clock when you agree they should happen at 8 o'clock. These type of things. And, to understand the relationship between the access to capital, the access to project, and the framework of investment climate and administrative stability and regulatory stability is very important. And again, in many of my conversations with good colleagues from emerging economies and developing countries, I always point out, if you get the regulatory regime right, you are on a good track.
And we're also seeing that it's less difficult to do projects in middle-income countries, obviously, than the very poor ones. And with the more dysfunctional, the harder it is, obviously, to get projects done. And also harder it is to bring private capital along.
And I just explain just a bit practically, because to put up a coal-fired plant, you build a plant, you buy the coal, you fire it up, and there's electricity coming out, but you pollute the planet. And it's not cheap because you have to pay for the coal, and even more so if you have to pay for the gas. If you have a renewable system, the unit price goes down, which is very attractive in a poor country, although sometimes problematic for an investor, because what is the yield? But still, that can be dealt with. But you need to make sure that you balance these different sources. And that, that makes that transition more complicated in countries with a weak regulatory regime than countries with a well-established regulatory regime.
And on that, I mean, later today we'll be discussing net zero and just transition. In Norfund, we're sometimes confronted by criticism on the fact that Africa as a continent in total stands for some 4% of the total accumulated CO2 emissions of the world. And still, we, coming particularly from an oil country, we are reluctant to invest in sectors that are high emitters. What's your response to that criticism?
Yeah, well, so, the good side of Africa, it has a good, and most African countries have a rather good energy mix. The problem is they don't have enough energy. So the mix is good, but the amount is too little, and you need much more energy, but energy that should also be, of course, clean, hence inexpensive over time, and utilized for manufacturing and in other means to move up the value chain. And one conversation which I would like to use the opportunity to raise is that there is, in my view, humble opinion, a misunderstanding in many emerging and developing countries about CBAMs. They think that is a barrier to growth. Quite on the contrary, if you invest in renewables and if you have reasonably low labor costs and abundance of resources close to you, you're actually much better off in Western markets and developed markets if they have CBAM than without, because you're competing with more advanced economies with a more heavy fossil component, which makes these products more expensive when they come to, for instance, the European market. So, we should make sure that we are taking the necessary measures in our countries to give a realistic price of carbon, either it's our own carbon or imported carbon emissions, but in such a way that it also opens these markets for developing countries that gets it when it comes to the need to invest in renewable alternatives to fossil emissions.
So basically, you're saying CBAM, maybe putting a toll on carbon footprint or whatever.
Carbon border adjustment mechanism. Just learn that by tomorrow morning. And you'll all love it. Yeah.
So you basically also,
I do.
So you're also seeing it as it could be an opportunity for countries that have a relatively high renewable energy mix.
Yes, because that makes your product relatively cheaper as an end product, because it competes with products that are possibly made by more advanced economies, but with a lot of coal in the energy mix.
Lastly, changing tack, many European capitals have started seeing Africa through more geopolitical lens, and your ministry is in the final stage of preparing a new Africa strategy, a Norwegian African strategy. Is there a new relevance of Africa to Europe?
Yes. Africa has always been relevant to Europe, sometimes in ways not very constructive to the Africans, to be admit, but always relevant. But what we're saying now is that we're seeing a competition for Africa between, opposing industrialized economies who are competing over influence in Africa, big time. This has been exacerbated by the increase in geopolitical tension. That reminds us that Africa is very relevant for us. Makes it more important to be present, to be a partner, a good long-term, credible partner for African countries, which is really where you will see quite a lot of growth, in my view. It's a very young population, it's growing fast. There is, the sources of resources, potential for renewable energy is very high, but you need to get this combination of an international global interest in investments with regulatory developments and political governance stability that will create a lot of opportunity for Africans, but also for us.
So I like the fact that you used the word opportunity, right?
Absolutely.
Which it is. But lastly, final question. We are seeing increasingly investments and activities from countries in the Middle East, Turkey, India, China, not to forget, in Africa. Are you worried about that type of competition? from a European perspective?
Well, I mean, the when competition happens in sort of an equal playing field, I think competition is good. It inspires, gives different sources. A country can have more donors to choose between. But of course, if this sort of comes with alternative systems, alternative value set to those that I happen to hold dear and what we think in the democratic societies, focusing on rule of law and democracy, it is problematic, which is exactly why we should not abandon, but actually take more an active part in all aspects of not only Africa's development, but also listen to what they do. And one thing we are doing with the African group in the UN is that we have actually broken with many other Western countries on one specific issue. We believe in the Global Tax Convention. We very much cherish the work in the OECD, but we do need a UN Global Tax Convention because to be a state, you need to be able to get hold of, through taxation, some of the value created in your country. And there are many so-called poor countries where there is a lot of wealth, but the wealth disappears before the state gets a piece of it, either because of multilateral companies or local wealthy people who place them in Zurich or Dubai. So doing something with a global tax system is important for all countries in question, and there has been a strong African voice in favor of that. We support it. But it's also important for us, but before we use our taxpayers' money to help other countries develop, make sure they also tax the rich.
I think we certainly agree on that. But to sum up then, I'm glad to recognize that you support the work we're doing. You believe in the importance of the private sector to supplement other measures. And when traveling, when meeting other foreign ministers and other politicians, some countries are struggling to speak that voice. So help us in the development finance broader setting. And thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. And I'm very proud of the work that Norfund is doing. And I'm very happy to learn that the yield on your energy investments are higher than those of the sovereign wealth fund. That's not a critique of them because they're not supposed to take your risk. But it's still an interesting fact that risk is good. You actually make money from risk.
Thank you.
Thank you.